Hi friends, write in the comments what city you are from. Perhaps you also had similar stories. It is very interesting to know what happened in your corner of the world. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like it, share your thoughts or stories in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. There are more exciting and unexpected stories ahead. All characters and events described in this story are fictitious. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. Do not judge strictly. The sun was just a pale orange spot on the horizon when Jack Miller started the engine of his Freightliner Cascadia. The truck roared to life with a low, guttural roar that echoed through the worn leather of the driver's seat and penetrated Jack's very bones. He adjusted his cap, faded navy blue, embroidered with a logo of some long-defunct trucking company, and took a sip of coffee from a thermos that had seen better days. It was bitter, lukewarm, but it served its purpose, keeping his eyes open for another stretch of endless asphalt. I-80 stretched out before him, a gray ribbon cutting through the Nebraska plains, flat and featureless under a sky that couldn't decide whether to rain or just frown. Jack was 42, though lately he had been feeling older. The road had a way of aging a man, not just in the lines around his eyes or the gray that showed through his stubble, but deeper in the way his thoughts looped like the hum of tires on asphalt. He had driven freight across the country for 10 years, from Los Angeles to Chicago, from Chicago to Denver, from Denver to wherever the dispatcher sent him. It had carved a rut out of his life. The same routes, the same gas stations, the same country songs crackling from the radio. Jack wasn't complaining, not really. The routine was like an anchor. But lately the anchor had felt heavier, as if something were tugging at the edges of his calm, threatening to unravel it. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 5:47 am on schedule. He'd loaded up in Cheyenne at midnight, a shipment of auto parts bound for Des Moines. Nothing special, just another run. The CB radio hissed, a low hum of static, and the occasional voice of other drivers breaking the silence. Jack kept it on for company, though he rarely joined in conversation. Chatter wasn't his thing. 1-1, this is Big Boss, heading east on 80, the voice broke through the crackle. Anybody see a bear at marker 320? Over. Jack's lip twitched, almost a smile. Bear's cops were the least of his worries. He kept the speed steady at 65, the needle never creeping over the limit. Why ask for trouble? He reached for the volume knob, turned it down a fraction, and looked back at the road. The white lines blended into a rhythm, hypnotizing him, making the miles fly by. He liked it. Thinking too much on the road was dangerous. The phone buzzed in the cup holder, a cheap device bought a couple of years ago. The screen lit up with a photo of Linda, his wife, smiling in a flowing dress from some long-ago summer barbecue. Jack's chest tightened, a familiar ache. He touched the screen to answer. "Hello, honey," he said, his voice hoarse from the long silence. "Hi," Linda replied, her tone warm but tinged with the tiredness that comes from too many night shifts at the diner. "How are things?" "As always, just me and the road." He tried to put lightness into his words, although the truth was heavier. "How is it at home? You know, dishes in the sink, neighbor's dog screaming all night. The usual." She laughed, but it was a thin laugh, like she was trying to sound cheerful for his sake. "Do you ever eat anything besides gas station burritos?" Jack chuckled, glancing at the empty wrapper on the passenger seat. "Sorry, I'll stop in Des Moines for something decent. Promise." "I wish I had. I don't want to have to resuscitate you from a heart attack at 50. A pause heavy, as if she knew more than he was saying. "You look tired, Jack." He gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Long night, that's all." Uh-huh. She didn't believe it, but she didn't press. Linda was like that. She always knew when it was best not to butt in. "Call me when you stop for the night, okay? I miss you." "I miss you too," he said, and it was true. He ended the call and put the phone back, the screen going dark. He stared at it for a moment, as if it might provide the answer he couldn't find. Then he shook his head, turned up the volume on the radio, and let Merle Haggard's voice fill the cabin. The road stretched on, mile after mile of cornfields and billboards promising salvation or cheap burgers. Jack's mind wandered, as it always did when the world outside became a blur of green and gray. He thought about Linda, about the house they'd bought in 2009, old and in need of some work that never happened. He thought about the retirement he'd been saving for, though the numbers never added up to the freedom he dreamed of: a quiet lake, a fishing rod, no deadlines. He thought about the aching in his back that hadn't gone away in months, the way his hands sometimes shook when he poured coffee. Little things, annoying things, that he pushed down deep because what else was there to do? Keep driving. And that's what he did. At a gas station near North Platte, he decided to take a break. The lot was packed, trucks lined up like sleeping giants, their chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. Jack parked on the edge, away from the noise of the diner and the chatter of the drivers. He stretched, his joints crunching like gravel under his boots, and headed inside for coffee and maybe a sandwich if he felt like splurging. The place was like something from another era: checkered floors, vinyl couches, a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. It smelled of grease and burnt coffee. A waitress with a Darlene name tag was wiping down the counter with a rag that looked older than she was. Jack sat on a stool, nodding politely. "Coffee, honey?" Darlene asked, her voice hoarse as a smoker's. "Yes, please," Jack said, moving the thermos closer. "And a turkey sandwich, if you have one." She scribbled the order on her notepad, looking him over as if trying to figure out what kind of person he was. "Long flight, huh? Where are you headed?" "Des Moines," he answered shortly. "A fun little town," she chuckled, clearly knowing that it wasn't. She poured coffee, steam billowing, and went into the kitchen. Jack leaned back, looking around the room. A couple of drivers were sitting in a booth, laughing over plates of eggs and fries. A guy in a leather jacket sat at the end of the counter, sipping a Coke and staring at his phone like it owed him something. Something about him caught Jack's attention, maybe the way he was glancing at the door, like he was waiting for someone. Or maybe it was just boredom making him notice things. Jack shook the thought away and took a sip of coffee, the scalding taste bringing him back to reality. Darlene returned with a sandwich, a mountain of turkey and bacon on rye that looked better than he'd expected. "Here, honey. If you need anything else, just holler." "Thanks," Jack said, giving her a half smile. He ate slowly, savoring the crunch of the lettuce, the saltiness of the bacon. The food reminded him of home, of Linda's cooking before the night shift at the diner took her evenings. He wondered what she was doing now. Probably sleeping in before her shift. He decided to call her later, say something nice, and make her smile. The man in the leather jacket stood up, throwing a few bills on the counter. He moved quickly, too quickly, as if he'd gotten a bad message. Jack watched him go, noticing the flash of something under his jacket, a belt buckle or something. A twitch of unease stirred in his stomach, but he shook it off. Nonsense. Too many sleepless nights, too much coffee. The air in the truck's cab felt stifling and tight. Jack cracked the window, letting in the cool Nebraska breeze. He checked his log, scribbled a few lines for the inspectors, and started the engine. The road was calling, as always. But as he pulled out of the lot, he glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the guy in the leather jacket. No one. Paranoia, he decided. Too much coffee. The radio crackled again. "This is Road Dog, heading east on 80. Anyone seen a bear? Over." Jack reached for the microphone, then thought better of it. Why, he didn't like to talk, not to strangers, not even to the voices that kept him company. Instead, he turned up the volume on the radio, and Willie Nelson's guitar filled the silence. The miles passed, and the tension in his shoulders eased a little. But the feeling wouldn't go away, like a splinter under his skin. Something was wrong. Not the truck, not the road, but something deeper, something he couldn't name. He'd felt it before, in moments when he'd woken up in a motel and couldn't remember where he was, or when Linda's voice on the phone seemed too far away. It felt like he'd taken a wrong turn somewhere, not on the highway, but in life. He glanced at the passenger seat, where a crumpled pack of Marlboros lay next to a burrito wrapper. He'd quit smoking years ago, for Linda's sake, but he'd kept the pack as a talisman for those nights when the road was too quiet. He picked it up, turned it over in his hand, tossed it back. Not today. The sun was setting, streaking the sky with pink and gold. His watch said 6:32 p.m. He'd make it to the Lincoln lot by nightfall, get a few hours sleep before Des Moines. Just a normal trip, he told himself. Just a normal day. But the road hummed with something new, something restless. The white lines merged, the horizon shimmered, and for a moment Jack Miller felt as if he were driving toward something greater than himself, something he might not be ready for. Dusk was falling over the Nebraska plains when Jack Miller pulled off I-80 onto the rutted gravel driveway that led to the Prairie Star Motel. The neon sign flickered unevenly, the letter Z flickering on and off, casting a dim glow across the building's battered facade. The motel was as familiar as an old scar, nothing special, just a place to collapse for a few hours until his body and mind stopped buzzing from the road. Jack had stayed there dozens of times over the years, and each time it had been the same. The creaky bed, the smell of stale tobacco in the curtains, the weak water pressure in the shower. But tonight, something in the air seemed different, subtle, like the slight bitterness in your coffee that you don't notice until you take your second sip. He killed the engine and silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the distant hum of trucks on the highway. Jack rubbed his eyes, feeling the fatigue settle in his bones like dust on old furniture. The clock on the dashboard said 8:14 p.m. It was time to take a break, sleep until at least 3 in the morning so he could be on the outskirts of Des Moines by dawn. He reached for his phone to call Linda, as he had promised. The screen lit up, but there were no new messages or missed calls. He punched her number and waited. The beeps came one after another, long and monotonous, like the ticking of a clock in an empty room. Linda didn't answer. Jack frowned at the screen, where her name still glowed in the cold light. Maybe she was on shift, he thought, or asleep. Or her phone was dead. He knew Linda wasn't the type to miss calls without a reason, but he shrugged off the worry. I'll call again later, he decided, and put the phone in his pocket. Grabbing his duffel bag, a battered duffel with a zipper that kept sticking, Jack climbed out of the cab. The cool evening air smelled of grass and exhaust, and he took a deep breath, trying to clear the heaviness from his chest. The Prairie Star Motel was the same as always, a one-story building with peeling paint, a dozen rooms, and a parking lot with 2 trucks and a battered Ford pickup with rusty fenders. Jack headed toward the front desk, his boots crunching on the gravel, the echo of a Willie Nelson song he'd been listening to an hour earlier playing in his head. Roy McKinney, the owner of the motel, stood behind the desk. Roy was a man in his 50s, with thick graying hair combed back and a smile that seemed both sincere and rehearsed. His plaid shirt was rolled up to his elbows, revealing tanned arms covered in old tattoos that had faded to a pale blue. Roy was the kind of guy who could get anyone to talk, even someone as quiet as Jack. Usually their conversations revolved around the weather, the price of gas, or gossip about other drivers, but today Roy seemed different. His smile was there, but his eyes were slightly narrowed, as if he were peering past Jack. "Jack Miller, you old tramp," Roy cried as Jack entered, the doorbell still ringing in the air. "How many years, how many winters?" "About 2 weeks," Jack muttered, putting his bag down. He tried to smile, but it came out a bit forced. "Got a room?" "There's always something for you," Roy said, leafing through the thick register, though they both knew the motel was full of vacancies. "How's the drive? Same old route?" "Yeah, Cheyenne to Des Moines. Nothing new." Jack took out his wallet, pulled out a couple of crumpled 20s. "Give me something quiet, if you can." Roy nodded, but his gaze lingered on Jack a little longer than usual. "Quiet, huh? Room 10 will do. Far from the highway, no one will bother you." He held out a key, an old-fashioned one with a plastic keychain that said Prairie Star on it. "How's Linda? Still feeding truckers pies at her diner?" "That's right," Jack replied, but the word Linda stung him, reminding him of the unanswered call. He took the key and nodded. "See you in the morning, Roy." "Good night, Jack," Roy said, but his voice was a little quieter than usual, and when Jack turned toward the door, he heard Roy whispering something to the woman behind the counter, a young woman with tired eyes and dyed red hair. Jack couldn't make out the words, but the tone was quick, tight, as if they didn't want to be heard. He paused at the threshold, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Something about the whisper caught him, like a hook digging into his skin. But he shook it off. Tired, he told himself. Just tired. Room 10 was exactly as he remembered it. A bed with a sagging mattress, a flowered bedspread, and a TV that got 3 channels on a nice day. Jack dropped his bag on the floor, sat on the edge of the bed, and pulled out his phone. He dialed Linda again. Beeps. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. He frowned, feeling a cold, sticky worry building in his chest. Linda always answered, even when she was busy, even when she was angry. He texted her, "Call when you can." At the motel. All okay. He sent it. The screen flickered, confirming delivery, but there was no answer. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, where old leaks were yellowing. The room smelled of damp and something else, old carpet, maybe something worse. Jack closed his eyes, trying to push away the thoughts that were creeping into his head. Linda was probably just busy, or her phone was dead, or she'd left it at home. But those explanations sounded like excuses, and he knew it. Something was wrong, and it clung to him like burrs to clothing. He remembered Roy, the whispers behind the bar. Jack had never been one for gossip, but Roy always knew more than he let on. The Prairie Star was a stopover for truckers, but sometimes others came in, people who didn't want to be seen. Jack had heard the stories: smuggling, drugs, fugitives. He'd never gotten involved in those things, kept his distance. But today, something in Roy's eyes, or in his whispers, made Jack wonder if he'd missed something important. He stood up, walked to the window, and pulled back the curtain. The parking lot was almost empty, just his truck, the rusty pickup, and one other car, a black sedan with tinted windows that he hadn't noticed before. Light from the reception windows fell on the asphalt, and for a moment Jack thought he saw a figure standing there. A man tall in a dark jacket, maybe the same one from the diner that day. Jack blinked, and the figure was gone, melting into the shadows. He exhaled, rubbed his face. Paranoia. The road was playing tricks on his mind. But he checked the lock on the door anyway. He clicked the bolt, just to be sure. Then he lay back down, still dressed, only taking off his shoes. Sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he lay listening to sounds: the distant rumble of the highway, the creaking of the bed in the next room, the rustle of the wind outside the window, and something else, quiet, almost elusive. Footsteps, or just his imagination. He picked up the phone again. The screen was blank. Linda didn't answer. Jack clenched his jaw, feeling something heavy growing inside him, like someone had placed a stone on his chest. He tried to remember the last time she had gone so long without answering. He couldn't remember. Maybe it would be okay in the morning, he thought. Maybe it was just a bad night. But when he closed his eyes, an image appeared. Linda standing at the window of their house, looking out into the darkness, as if she were waiting for someone. Or something. Jack shook his head, pushing the image away. He rolled onto his side, drawing his knees up, as if that would protect him from what he was feeling. Tomorrow he will drive to Des Moines. Tomorrow he will talk to Linda. Tomorrow everything will be like it always was. But deep down he knew something had changed, and that something was waiting for him ahead, in the darkness, around the next bend in the road. The darkness in room number 10 was thick, almost tangible, but sleep did not come. Jack lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, where the stains from the leaks seemed like a map of some alien, unfriendly world. The phone lying on the nightstand was silent, and this silence was more oppressive than the roar of the engine on the highway. Linda did not answer his call, did not reply to his message. This was not in her character, and Jack felt a cold lump growing in his chest, as if someone was slowly squeezing his heart. He tried to brush off the anxiety, telling himself that she was just busy, that everything would be explained in the morning. But thoughts, like flies, circled over the same point, giving him no peace. He stood up without turning on the light and went to the window. The curtain, smelling of dust and old tobacco, swung open with a soft rustle. The Prairie Star Motel parking lot lay before him, lit by the dim glow of a street lamp and a blinking neon sign. His truck was where he'd left it, massive and still as a sleeping animal. Next to it sat a rusty pickup truck and the black sedan with tinted windows he'd noticed earlier. But something else caught his eye. At the far edge of the lot, almost hidden in the shadows, was another car. A silver Hyundai Santa Fe. Jack froze. It was Linda's car. The same scuff marks on the rear bumper, the same sticker flower on the rear window, a birthday present from her sister. His heart sank as if the truck had fallen off a cliff. He stepped back from the window, his blood pounding in his temples. This couldn't be true. Linda worked at a diner 300 miles away in Wyoming. Why would she be here? Was he mistaken? Was it just a similar car? But the sticker, the bumper, even the license plate, it all matched. Jack grabbed the phone, dialed her number again. Beeps. 5, 6, 7. Nothing. He threw the phone on the bed, clenching his fists, trying to stop his hands from shaking. He had to check. He had to know. He pulled on his boots without tying them and slipped out of the room. The cool night air hit his face, but it did nothing to cool the heat that burned inside. The parking lot was quiet, except for the distant honking of trucks on the highway. Jack walked up to the Hyundai, his footsteps crunching on the gravel, too loud in the silence. He peered inside. Her purse was on the passenger seat, the one with the scuffed leather and the broken zipper she kept meaning to replace. Jack felt the ground shift beneath his feet. It was her car. No doubt about it. He turned toward the motel, his gaze flickering to the front desk. The light was on in the window, but there was no one behind the desk. Roy, the same Roy with his smooth smile and tattoos, was gone. Jack remembered the whispers behind the desk, the strange look Roy had given him when he checked in. Something inside him clicked like a shotgun. He walked toward the building, not thinking, not planning, driven only by this hot, aching feeling he couldn't even name. The reception door creaked open as he walked in. The girl with the red hair, the one who had been whispering to Roy, was sitting behind the counter, leafing through a magazine. She looked up, and her face froze for a moment, as if she knew he was coming. "Where's Roy?" Jack asked, his voice low, almost growling. He's busy," she replied, looking away. "Do you need something?" "Where is he?" Jack repeated, stepping closer. His fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms. The girl hesitated, her fingers nervously fiddling with the corner of the magazine. "He's probably in the back room. I can call." "Don't," Jack snapped. He noticed the door behind the counter, slightly ajar, and muffled voices coming from it. One of them was familiar, low, and slightly hoarse. Roy. And the other, Jack felt his blood run cold. It was Linda. He didn't remember getting to the door. He didn't remember pushing it, or how it hit the wall with a dull thud. The room was small, littered with boxes and old furniture, and there, in the corner, they were. Roy, his perpetual smile now pale and strained, and Linda, her face a mixture of shock and guilt. She was wearing her usual denim jacket, her hair disheveled, as if she'd just arrived. She held a cup of coffee in her hands, but her fingers were shaking, and the coffee spilled onto the floor. "Jack," she began, but her voice broke. "What are you doing here?" The words burst out of Jack like a gunshot. He stepped forward, not noticing Roy retreating to the wall. "What are you doing to him?" "Jack, look, I can explain." Linda raised her hands as if she could stop the storm that was already brewing. "It's not what you think." "Not that," Jack nearly screamed, his voice echoing off the walls. "Your car's in the parking lot, Linda. Your bag. You're here with him in the middle of the night, and that's not that." Roy raised his hands, trying to intervene. "Jack, bro, calm down. Nothing's going on. We're just—" "Shut up," Jack snapped, turning on him. His eyes were blazing, his fists shaking. "You knew I was married. You knew, Roy." "Jack, I don't—" Roy began, but he didn't get to finish. Jack stepped forward, and his fist connected with Roy's jaw with a dull crunch. Roy staggered back, hitting the table, and Linda's coffee fell to the floor, shattering. Linda screamed, rushed to Jack, and grabbed his arm. "Stop it! Jack, stop it!" she screamed, but he didn't hear. All he saw was Roy rising from the floor, blood on his lip, and his own life collapsing like a house of cards. Roy straightened up, wiping the blood away with his sleeve. "You shouldn't have done that, Jack," he said, his voice cold now, without a trace of its former friendliness. "You don't know what you're getting into." "I know enough," Jack growled, preparing to strike again, but Linda stepped between them, her eyes full of tears. "Jack, please," she begged. "It's not what you think. I came here to talk to Roy about money. We need money, Jack. You know how hard it is for us." "Money?" Jack froze, his breathing heavy as if he'd run a mile. "You come here in the middle of the night to talk about money? With him?" "It's true," Linda said, her voice shaking. "I didn't want to tell you because I knew you'd be mad. Roy offered to help. He knows people who can lend money." Jack looked at Roy, who was now standing against the wall, wiping blood from his face. His smile was gone, and there was something dark in his eyes that Jack didn't like. "What people, Linda?" he asked, not taking his eyes off Roy. "What money?" Before she could answer, sirens sounded outside. Red and blue lights flashed in the windows, reflected on the walls. The police. The girl at the front desk must have called them when she heard the noise. Jack felt his heart sink. Everything was falling apart, right here in this stuffy back room, surrounded by the smell of coffee and old furniture. The door swung open and two policemen walked in, their hands on their holsters. "State your name," said one of them, a stocky man with short hair and a stern look. "Jack Miller," Jack replied, his voice hoarse, almost alien. He raised his hands, showing that he was not going to resist. "He's the one who attacked me," Roy said, pointing at Jack. His voice was calm, almost mocking. "No reason. He just came in and hit me." "That's not true," Linda cried, her face wet with tears. He just misunderstood." "Ma'am, calm down," said the second policeman, younger, with tired eyes. "We'll sort this out. Everyone to the station." Jack didn't resist as he was led out of the motel in handcuffs. The cold metal on his wrists was almost comforting, as if it confirmed that this was all real. Linda followed, trying to explain, but her words were lost in the sirens and his own thoughts. He'd seen her car, he'd seen the broken cup on the floor, he'd seen the blood on Roy's face, and it all added up to a picture he didn't want to accept. He sat silently in the police car, looking out the window. The neon sign of the motel flickered, the letter Z fading on and off as if mocking him. Linda sat next to him, but there was a gulf between them that he didn't know how to cross. He wanted to ask her why she was there, what she was hiding, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he looked at the road, the dark ribbon of asphalt that had always been his refuge, his home. Now it seemed foreign. The station was cold and smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. Jack sat on a hard chair, answering questions from a police officer who was writing everything down in a notebook. Roy had filed a report, claiming that Jack had attacked him for no reason. Linda tried to explain that it had been a misunderstanding, but her voice was shaking, and Jack could see the officer looking at her doubtfully. He didn't know what to believe. All he knew was that his world, so familiar and stable, had crumbled to pieces, like a mirror falling to the floor. It was already dawn when he was released on his own recognizance. Linda was waiting for him outside, her eyes red from crying. "Jack," she began, but he raised his hand, stopping her. "Not now," he said, his voice empty as a burnt-out desert. "I need time." He walked to his truck without looking back. The road was waiting, and despite everything, it was the only thing he still understood. But now, as he climbed behind the wheel, he felt like he wasn't just driving to Des Moines. He was driving toward something else, toward a truth he might not want to know. Morning light streamed through the foggy glass of the truck, but to Jack Miller it was a gray, viscous haze that only emphasized the emptiness inside. He sat motionless behind the wheel, clutching a phone that no longer rang. Linda had sent his last text 2 days ago, after that night in the motel, a short, knife-like message, "We need to talk when you get back." But Jack had not returned. He had not driven to Des Moines, had not dropped off the load, had not answered the dispatcher's calls. Instead, he had simply driven aimlessly on roads that had once been his refuge, but now felt like a cage. It all started that morning at the police station. After he was released on his own recognizance, he got in his truck and drove away, leaving Linda standing in the driveway, her face a blur in the rearview mirror. He couldn't talk to her, couldn't look her in the eye. The image of her in that back room with Roy, her voice shaking as she tried to explain something he didn't want to understand, burned inside him like acid. He drove until he ran out of gas and stopped at a gas station somewhere in Iowa. There, in the dim light of a streetlight, he dialed his boss, Tom, and told her he quit. "Jack, what happened?" Tom's voice was full of surprise, but Jack didn't let him finish. "I'm done," he said, his voice as dead as the asphalt beneath his feet. "Find another driver." He hung up without waiting for an answer. It had been easy, too easy. 10 years of driving, 10 years of routes, schedules, loads all gone in an instant like smoke. Jack felt no relief, only emptiness. He sold the truck a week later, giving it to a dealer in Omaha for half price. The money he got was modest, but it was enough to buy an old 1987 Chevy van, rusty, with a cracked windshield and an engine that coughed like an old sick man. It wasn't a home, but it was all he had left. Linda filed for divorce 3 weeks later. The papers arrived in the mail at the motel where he was staying to shower and sleep. He signed them without reading them, sitting at a rickety table in a room that smelled of mildew. He didn't call her, didn't ask why. He knew what she would say, that he'd left, that he'd never given her a chance to explain, that he'd ruined everything himself. Maybe she was right, but Jack didn't want to hear the truth, her version or his. He folded the papers into an envelope, mailed them back, and left town without leaving an address. His life now was contained within the van. He slept in the back seat, rolled up in an old blanket that smelled of gasoline and sweat. He ate whatever he found at gas stations: chips, sandwiches in plastic wrap, cheap coffee that burned his throat. But mostly he drank. Bourbon, whiskey, sometimes just beer if his money was running low. The alcohol didn't dull the pain, but it softened it, as if someone had cast a veil over it. He drank alone, parked in vacant lots or outside abandoned warehouses where no one asked questions. Sometimes he turned on the radio, but the old country songs he'd once loved were now jarring, reminding him of Linda, of home, of a life that was gone. Friends, what few he had, disappeared as quickly as his job. He stopped answering his phones, stopped stopping at the familiar dives where drivers gathered to chat over coffee. His old partner, Bill, called a few times, leaving voicemails. "Jack, where the hell are you? What's wrong with you?" Jack listened in the dark of the van, but didn't call back. What could he say? That his life had shattered like glass under a hammer? That he didn't know how to put it back together? Eventually, Bill stopped calling. So did everyone else. One night, parked at an abandoned gas station somewhere in Kansas, Jack pulled out a bottle of Jim Beam and drank half of it without looking up. He looked at the stars through the cracked windshield, but they seemed cold, alien, like the eyes of strangers. He remembered Linda, not the one in the motel back room, but the one laughing at their first wedding in a cheap dress, a flower in her hair. He remembered her dancing with him to an old Elvis song, her laugh ringing like a bell. Then he thought it would be forever. Now he didn't know what was real and what was just an illusion he'd created for himself. He finished the bottle and threw it out the window. The glass shattered, the shards scattering across the asphalt like stars falling to earth. Jack laughed, a hoarse, bitter sound that was immediately drowned in silence. He felt as if he were falling, but not into an abyss, but into some endless void where there was no bottom, no end, only darkness and the echo of his own thoughts. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. Jack lost track of time. His beard grew long, tangled and gray, his clothes saturated with the smell of sweat and alcohol. He lived like a ghost, moving from one town to another, from one gas station to another. Sometimes he found odd jobs unloading boxes in warehouses, washing dishes in diners for cash. But the money went quickly, mostly on booze. He didn't think about the future, because there was no future. There was only now this moment, this drink, this rusty van creaking around every turn. One day, in a bar on the outskirts of some nameless town, he met a man who reminded him of Roy. The same smooth voice, the same smile that promised more than it said. The man offered Jack a job, simple, no questions asked. Move boxes from one town to another, no one looking inside. Jack looked at him, at his clean shirt and expensive watch, and felt something stir inside him. Not a spark, not hope, but something dark, as if part of him wanted to get involved, to drown. "How much?" he asked, his voice hoarse from whiskey and long silence. 500, the man replied, his eyes glittering like a predator's. Half now, half later. Jack nodded without thinking. He took the money, stuffed it into his jeans pocket, and walked out of the bar. The boxes were waiting for him in the abandoned warehouse, dark and unmarked. He didn't ask what was inside. He didn't want to know. He loaded them into the van, feeling something inside him break completely. This wasn't just cargo. This was a choice, a step into an abyss from which there was no escape. That night, driving the boxes down a lonely road, Jack turned on the radio, but got only static. He turned it off and drove in silence, listening to the van's engine cough as if it were complaining about its fate. He thought of Linda, the way she had looked that night in the motel, her tears, the words he hadn't let her finish. He thought of Roy, the blood on his fist, and of himself, the man he had been and the man he had become. The van turned into a dirt road that led to an abandoned farm where a man in a dark jacket was waiting. Jack stopped, turned off the engine, and got out. The night was cold, and his breath curled in the air. He felt like this was the end not of his life, but of something greater. Of his conscience, of his hopes, of himself. "Are the boxes okay?" the man asked, his voice as sharp as a blade. Jack nodded, not looking him in the eye. He opened the rear doors of the van, and the man began to check the cargo. Jack stood to the side, feeling the cold creeping under his jacket, as if the night itself wanted to get under his skin. He didn't know what was in the boxes, but he knew it was wrong. And yet here he was. When the man left, leaving the other half of the money behind, Jack got into the van and stared at the crumpled bills in his hand for a long time. 500, the price of his downfall. He pocketed the money, started the engine, and drove away into the darkness, not knowing where the road would lead him. But he knew one thing for sure: there was no turning back. Darkness had fallen over Kansas like a heavy blanket, and only a thin sliver of moon broke through the tattered clouds, casting a feeble glow on the lonely road. Jack Miller parked his rusty Chevy on the shoulder of a deserted stretch of highway, somewhere between nameless towns that weren't even worth mentioning on a map. The van's engine died with a hoarse sigh, and the silence fell upon him, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote and the rustle of the wind in the dry grass. He leaned back in the seat, feeling the weariness settle in his bones like sand in an old machine. A bottle of cheap whiskey lay on the passenger seat, half empty, but he didn't touch it today. He didn't want to. Instead, he just sat there, staring out the cracked windshield, where the reflection of his face, hairy, sunken-eyed, looked like someone else's. 3 months had passed since the night he had moved the boxes for the man in the dark jacket. Since then, Jack had taken any job that was offered, driving freight without question, unloading trucks in warehouses, scrubbing the floors of diners for a few dollars. The money went on gas and food and whiskey, but he didn't count it. Life had narrowed to the simple movements of starting the van, driving to the next stop, finding a place to sleep. He didn't think about the past, about Linda, about the divorce, about who he had been. It was too painful, like picking at an open wound. But sometimes, on nights like this, the memories would come through, fuzzy as old photographs, but sharp enough to cut. He reached for the pack of cigarettes he was now smoking, despite his promises to Linda years ago. He lit up, blowing smoke out the open window, and suddenly noticed headlights in the distance. A car, an old blue Dodge with peeling paint, was parked on the side of the road, about 100 yards from his van. The hood was up, and a figure loomed next to it, thin, almost lost in the darkness. Jack squinted, trying to make out details. A woman, judging by the silhouette. She was bent over the engine, her movements sharp, irritated. Nearby, at the side of the road, sat a small girl, hugging her knees, her face hidden by her long hair. Jack took another drag on his cigarette, feeling the smoke scrape his throat. His first thought was simple: none of my business. He was no hero, not even a good Samaritan. He had spent the last few months living for himself, or rather existing, like a shadow that moves but leaves no trace. But something about the scene, the woman tinkering with the engine, the child sitting alone by the road had caught him. Maybe it was the weariness of his own emptiness. Maybe it was something else. He stubbed his cigarette out on the edge of the windowsill, climbed out of the van, and walked toward the Dodge. His boots crunched on the gravel, the sound loud in the still night. The woman looked up as he approached, and her hand went to her jeans pocket, as if searching for something, a knife, maybe, or pepper spray. Her face, lit by the weak moonlight, was young but drawn, with dark circles under her eyes. She couldn't have been more than 30, but life had already taken its toll on her. "Everything okay?" Jack asked, stopping a few steps away. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken all day. The woman looked at him, her eyes narrowed, assessing. "The car stalled," she said, her tone sharp but weary. "It won't start. We've been stuck here for an hour." Jack nodded, looking at the engine. "Can I see it?" She hesitated, then stepped aside. "Go ahead. You can't do any worse." He leaned over the engine, smelling the familiar scent of oil and metal. He had been good at fixing cars, once not a master, but good enough to get a truck out of trouble on the highway. He checked the wires, the battery, and the fuel pump. Everything looked old, worn, like his own van. "Looks like the fuel filter is clogged," he said, straightening up. "Or the pump is dead. We'll have to get it checked at the station." The woman snorted, crossing her arms. "Fine. The nearest station is 20 miles away, and I don't have a cent." She glanced at the girl, who was still sitting by the side of the road, playing with a rock. "And we need to move on." Jack glanced at the child. The girl was skinny, about 8 years old, wearing a tattered jacket that was too big for her. Her hair was tangled, and her face was pale, as if she hadn't eaten properly in a long time. Something in her gaze, empty but tenacious, reminded Jack of himself, of what he had become in the last few months. He looked away, feeling something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not pity, not quite. Something deeper. "I have tools," he said, nodding toward his van. "I can try to clean the filter. If that doesn't work, I'll give you a ride to the station." The woman looked at him, her gaze full of suspicion. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice quieter but not softer. "We are nothing to you." Jack shrugged, unsure how to respond. He didn't know why he'd stopped. Maybe it was because the night was too quiet and his own thoughts were too loud. Maybe it was because he was tired of being a nobody. "Just like that," he muttered. "Just sit here and I'll get the keys." He walked back to the van and pulled a toolbox from under the seat, old and rusty, but still full. When he returned, the woman introduced herself. "I'm Claire," she said, her voice a little less scratchy. "This is Mia, my daughter." "Jack," he said, not looking at her. He crouched down by the car, began removing the fuel filter. Mia looked up, her eyes following him, but she said nothing. Jack felt her gaze like a gentle pressure on the back of his head, but he kept working. His hands moved confidently despite the months of oblivion. It was familiar, taking apart, fixing, putting back together. Something he could still do. "Where are you going?" he asked, more to fill the silence than out of curiosity. Claire paused, as if deciding whether to answer. "Oklahoma," she finally said. "I have a sister there. She might be able to help." Jack nodded without asking further. He could hear it in her voice, the understatement, the story she didn't want to tell. He knew stories like that. His own was no better. The filter was clogged, as he thought. Jack cleaned it out as best he could and put it back in. "Try starting it," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. Claire got behind the wheel and turned the key. The engine coughed and rumbled, but didn't start. She tried again, then slammed the steering wheel and cursed. Damn, I knew it. The pump, Jack said. It needs replacing. He looked at Mia, who was now standing closer, holding the same pebble. I have a rope. I can pull you to the station. Claire looked at him, her face a mixture of weariness and disbelief. How much do you want for this? Nothing, Jack said, and it was true. He didn't know why, but the thought of leaving them here in the middle of the night felt wrong. For the first time in a long time, he felt something other than empty. Not hope, not a spark, just a hint that he might still be alive. Jack didn't answer, just nodded toward his van. Get ready. The station's 20 miles away. I'll get you there. He turned and walked toward his van, not giving Claire time to object. As he hooked the rope to her Dodge, Mia stepped closer, her little boots crunching on the gravel. Do you know how to fix cars? She asked, her voice quiet but clear as a bell. Jack looked at her, surprised. A little, he said, tightening the knot. Enough to keep us from getting stuck on the road. My dad could fix cars too, Mia said, looking at her shoes. He left. Jack froze, his fingers hovering on the cable. He didn't know what to say. Sympathy seemed foreign, out of place. Instead, he simply nodded. It happens, he muttered, and it was all he could muster. Claire watched him from the driver's seat, her face tense. You don't have to do this, she said when Jack had finished with the cable. I mean it. We're not your concern. I know, he replied, getting behind the wheel of his van. Let's go. The drive to the service station was long and silent. Claire and Mia rode in their Dodge, tied to Jack's van, and he watched the road, feeling something stir inside him. It wasn't relief or joy, but something more fragile, like the first shoots after a long winter. He wasn't helping them because he had something to prove or a sense of duty. He was helping them because, looking at Mia, at her thin shoulders and empty eyes, he saw himself not who he was now, but who he might have been if he hadn't stopped at the side of the road. At the brightly lit station, the mechanic, an older man with oily hands and a good-natured smile, confirmed that the fuel pump was dead. A new one will cost about 200 plus labor, he said, wiping his hands with a rag. I can have it installed by lunch tomorrow. Claire turned pale, her fingers tightening around her purse. I don't have that kind of money, she said quietly, so Mia wouldn't hear. Jack, standing off to the side, felt his hand go to his pocket. There was the 500 he had received for hauling the boxes. He hadn't spent it, not because he was saving it, but because it looked dirty, a reminder of his fall. But now he pulled out 2 bills and handed them to the mechanic. Do it today, he said, and check the oil while you're at it. Claire looked at him, her eyes wide. You, what? No, I can't take it. I already have, Jack said, looking away. Just go see your sister. Mia came up to him, her small hand touching his sleeve. Thank you, Mr. Jack, she said, and her voice was so sincere that Jack felt something inside him crack, like ice in the spring. You're welcome, he muttered, climbing into the van. He didn't look at Claire, didn't look at Mia. He just started the engine and drove away, leaving them at the station. But as he pulled out onto the highway, there was something new in his chest, not hope, not redemption, but a small, fragile light that hadn't been there before. For the first time in months, he felt like maybe all was not lost. The days after the encounter on the side of the road passed slowly, as if time had decided to give Jack a break so he could process what had happened. Claire and Mia had not disappeared from his life, as he had expected. After he had paid for the repairs to their car, Claire had insisted on thanking him. She had found him the next morning at the same service station where he had slept in his van and offered to buy him breakfast. Jack wanted to refuse. He was used to being alone, used to no one invading his space, but Mia, with her big eyes and shy smile, had simply taken his hand and pulled him toward the diner. He couldn't say no. In a small roadside diner that smelled of burnt toast and cheap coffee, they got to talking. Claire told them she used to work as a receptionist at a small hotel in Colorado until they laid her off during downsizing. She knew how to keep records, deal with guests, and keep things under control. Her voice would come alive when she talked about her work, with a spark that Jack hadn't noticed on the side of the road. Mia, sitting next to him over a plate of pancakes, listened to their conversation, occasionally interjecting her own childish comments that made Claire laugh and Jack chuckle, hiding a smile. For the first time in months, he felt something like warmth, as if someone had opened a window into his stuffy, musty life. They kept seeing each other. Claire and Mia decided to stay in town for a few weeks, while Claire looked for work, and Jack, for some reason, stayed. He took odd jobs fixing cars, unloading boxes, but he spent his evenings with them. Sometimes they would sit in the park, where Mia would play on the swings, and Claire would talk about her life. About the ex-husband who had left her and Mia, about her dream of starting her own business, about her sister in Oklahoma who was waiting for them, but couldn't help them with money. Jack listened, rarely speaking, but her voice, her stories, her presence slowly filled the void he carried inside him. He didn't talk about Linda, or the divorce, or the boxes he'd moved that night. But Claire seemed to sense that he had demons of his own, and she didn't pry. One day, the three of them were driving in Jack's van. Mia had insisted on driving out of town to watch the sunset when they came across an abandoned motel along an old road. The sign, weather-beaten and worn, read "The Silver Horseshoe," though half the letters were long faded. The building looked as if it had been abandoned for 20 years. The windows were boarded up, the paint was peeling, and the yard was filled with weeds growing through cracks in the asphalt. But something about the place had caught Jack's attention. Maybe it was its simplicity, its loneliness, so much like his own. "It's creepy," Claire said, looking out the van window at the motel. "But there's something about it, like it's waiting to be brought back to life." "Can I come in?" Mia asked, her eyes shining with curiosity. Jack shrugged. "If you're not afraid of ghosts." They climbed out of the van and walked up to the building. The reception door was ajar, creaking as Jack pushed it open. The inside smelled of dust and damp, but beneath the grime there was a hint of a former coziness. A dark wood counter, faded horseshoe wallpaper, an old couch with torn upholstery. Mia ran to look through the rooms, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallways, and Claire paused at the counter, her fingers sliding over the worn surface. "You know," she said, "I've worked in worse places. This place, it could use some fixing up. It needs some work, sure, but the structure is solid, and the location isn't bad, not far from the highway, but pretty secluded." Jack looked at her, surprised by her enthusiasm. "Do you think anyone would want to stay here?" "Truckers, tourists, whoever," Claire said, her voice firmer. "People are always looking for a place to rest. If you do it right, you can make money." Jack didn't answer, but her words stuck in his head. He walked around the motel, examining the walls, the wiring, the roof. Everything was in disrepair, but he could see that the foundation was solid and the damage was mostly cosmetic. He knew how to fix things, cars, houses, even his old life before it fell apart. Claire's idea to bring this place back to life seemed crazy, but also possible. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could do something worthwhile. The next day, they returned to the motel with flashlights and a notebook. Claire began writing down what needed to be renovated: new windows, paint, plumbing, furniture. Jack checked the wiring and plumbing, noting what still worked and what needed to be replaced. Mia ran around collecting rusty nails and old bottle caps as if they were treasures. Claire joked that she was their interior designer, and Mia laughed, for the first time since Jack had known her, truly, heartily. "It's going to be expensive," Jack said as they sat on the motel steps watching the sunset. "I'm not talking about renovating. Buying this place would be a fortune." "I know," Claire said, her voice serious but hopeful. "But I can take out a loan. I have experience. I know how to run a place like this. And you can fix it." Jack shook his head, running a hand over his face. "I have nothing, Claire. No money, no job. Just this van and a bunch of debts." "You have hands," she said, looking into his eyes, "and I've seen you work. You can do it. We can do it." He smiled wryly. What if it doesn't work out? What if we're in debt? What if this place falls apart again in a year? Claire was silent for a moment. The wind swayed the withered branches, the sky shimmered with the last colors of the setting sun. Then at least we'll try, she said quietly. I'm tired of being afraid, tired of waiting for life to get better. And you? Jack looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Mia, who was sitting on the porch, examining the lid she had found as if it were a treasure. Me too, he said finally. Damn, maybe we really can do this. We can do it, Claire said with a smile. Just promise me you won't run away the first night the power goes out. Only if you promise you won't change your mind when you see the bill for the new roof, Jack chuckled. They both laughed. And then they just sat there, silently, until the sun finally disappeared over the horizon, and in the silence the first spark of something new was born. This we caught him off guard. He wasn't used to being part of a we. After Linda, after everything, he thought he'd always be alone. But Claire and Mia, they were there, close by, and their presence was like an anchor, keeping him from falling into the abyss again. A week later, Jack made up his mind. He went to the bank in the next town over, feeling out of place in the clean shirt Claire had made him wear. He mortgaged his van and the last of his savings to get a loan. The bank clerk, a woman with tired eyes and a stern bun, studied his paperwork for a long time, asking questions about his income, his past. Jack answered honestly, not hiding the fact that he had been living like a vagabond for the past few months. But he told her about the motel, about Claire, about how they wanted to bring the place back to life. Something in his words, or maybe his desperation, convinced her. The loan was approved, a small one, but enough to buy the Silver Horseshoe and begin renovations. Work began immediately. Jack and Claire spent their days at the motel, stripping old wallpaper, fixing wiring, replacing pipes. Mia helped as best she could, sweeping floors, carrying tools, drawing on paper what she thought the rooms should look like. Jack taught her how to hold a hammer, showed her how to drive nails, and her delight when she drove a nail straight for the first time by herself made him smile, his first real, unforced smile in months. Their work brought them closer. In the evenings, when the sun went down, they would sit on the motel porch, drinking coffee from a thermos and talking. Claire would talk about her childhood in Colorado, about how she had dreamed of being an artist, but life had taken a different turn. Jack, to his surprise, began to open up. He told her about Linda, about that night in the motel, about how it had all fallen apart. He didn't talk about the boxes, about the shady deal, but Claire seemed to sense that he was holding something back, and she didn't press. She simply listened, and that was more than he had expected. Mia became their glue. She'd tug at Jack's hand to show him a lizard she'd found in the yard, or ask him to tell her how to fix cars. Her questions, her laughter, her belief that the motel would be the best place in the world melted something in Jack. He began to notice that he was drinking less. The bottle of whiskey in the van would sit untouched for weeks. He hadn't stopped drinking entirely, but it wasn't an escape anymore, just a habit he could control. The motel slowly came to life. They painted the walls a warm cream, replaced the windows, and fixed the roof. Claire had a new sign made. The Silver Horseshoe now glowed in bright neon, without flickering or interruptions. She had a plan, a motel for truckers and travelers, with clean rooms, good coffee, and a homey atmosphere. Jack, to his surprise, began to believe it. He saw Claire come alive as she ran the project, her eyes lighting up when she talked about the future. And he saw Mia running around the yard, laughing, as if the abandoned motel had become her own personal kingdom. One night, as they were painting the last room, Claire looked at Jack, her face smeared with paint, but smiling. You know, she said, I thought Mia and I were lost. But you pulled us out, and now we're pulling you out. Jack didn't answer, but her words settled on his heart like a warm blanket. He looked at Mia, curled up on the couch, asleep, and felt like he wasn't alone for the first time in a long time. The motel, Claire, Mia, they were his chance, his way to start over. And despite the fear, despite the shadows of the past, he knew he didn't want to waste it. The Silver Horseshoe shone in the night. its neon sign casting a soft glow on the freshly patched asphalt of the parking lot. The motel, which 6 months ago had been little more than a pile of weathered boards and memories of better times, was now alive. The rooms were clean, with new mattresses and curtains that smelled not of dust, but of lavender. Claire had transformed the reception area into a cozy nook with a coffee machine, a basket of homemade cookies, and an old radio blasting country tunes. Truckers and casual travelers began stopping by more often, leaving grateful comments in the guest book Claire had kept on the counter. Mia, with her boundless energy, rushed around the yard, helping water the flower beds or handing out homemade postcards with horseshoes painted on them to guests. The business, albeit slowly, was starting to bring in money enough to cover the bills and even put a little aside for the future. Jack stood at the entrance to one of the rooms, looking at the scene, and yet something inside him didn't add up. He fixed everything that broke: plumbing, wiring, creaking doors. His hands, calloused from work, were good at their job, and he was proud that the motel was standing, in part because of him. But every time he saw Claire smile at the guests or heard Mia humming as she ran down the hall, something heavy stirred in his chest, as if old weights he thought he'd shed were still hanging on. The past wouldn't let go. Linda, Roy, that night at the motel, the boxes he'd moved, they all came back like ghosts he couldn't shake off. The morning began as usual. Jack woke up in his room, small but clean, the one Claire had given him at the motel. He no longer slept in the van, though it still sat in the backyard, a reminder of his old life. Sometimes he looked at it before he fell asleep, as if he were afraid to forget who he had been, or who he no longer was. He brewed coffee in the communal kitchen, poured it into a chipped enamel mug, his favorite, despite its cracks, and stepped out onto the porch to breathe in the cool Kansas air. The sky was clear, with few clouds, and trucks hummed in the distance, reminding him of the road that had once been his home. Life on the road seemed distant now, like a dream, but the longing for it still sat somewhere in his chest, quietly, stubbornly. Claire emerged from the reception area, her hair pulled back into a messy bun and a notepad in her hands. She wore an old t-shirt and jeans with a paint stain on the knee. She looked tired but contented, confident, like someone who had finally begun to put her life back together. "Good morning," she said, smiling. "There's a couple coming in from Omaha today who said they're staying 3 nights, and another trucker called to reserve a room. We're almost full, Jack." "Not bad," he said, sipping his coffee. His voice was even friendly. But inside, something was clenching, like an invisible spring. The motel's success should have made him happy, but instead he felt like an outsider in this new life, like he'd accidentally found himself in someone else's movie, like he was occupying a place he didn't deserve. Claire noticed his mood. She always did. "Are you okay?" she asked, squinting. "You look like you swallowed a nail." "It's okay," Jack muttered, looking away. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to explain. How could he explain that every time he saw her or Mia, he remembered Linda? How could he explain that sometimes, looking at their happiness, he felt not joy, but guilt for the fact that he still had some life left, and she didn't? He squeezed his fingers around the mug, feeling the hot rim press against his skin, as if bringing him back to reality. "It's just the morning," he muttered. "You know, these days are too quiet." Claire didn't back down. She came closer and sat down next to him on the step. She was silent for a moment, giving him the opportunity to either withdraw into himself or open up. "I wake up sometimes too, and I think none of this is real," she said quietly. "That one day I'll wake up and the motel won't be there, and you won't be on the porch with that damn mug. Just silence and emptiness." He looked at her, surprised at how accurately she had expressed what he himself had been hesitant to formulate. "You're not alone, Jack," she continued. "Even if it feels that way, we've all lost something. But that doesn't mean we can't build something back. Together." He nodded. He didn't say a word, but something inside him shook, as if a piece of the wall inside him had finally cracked. Claire stood up and brushed the dust off her jeans. "Come on, we have a lot of things to do. And if you don't fix the boiler in room 3, I won't let anyone move in there, she said, already smiling. Yes, boss, Jack replied, almost smiling in response. Sometimes a new life begins not with big decisions, but with a simple phrase, let's go to work. Claire didn't press. She simply nodded and went to check the pantry, but her gaze lingered on him a little too long. Jack knew she was seeing more than he was telling her. It scared him and kept him there, too. The day had been busy. Jack had fixed a leaky faucet in the third room, helped unload a delivery of linens, and painted the porch railings. The work was distracting, but it didn't drown out his thoughts. Toward noon, as he sat in the utility room sorting through his tools, Mia ran in with a piece of paper in her hand. "Jack, look," she exclaimed, waving the drawing. "I drew a motel. There you are, there's Mom, and there's me." He picked up the paper. It showed three figures holding hands against the backdrop of a building with a bright sign. The drawing was childish, uneven, but there was so much warmth in it that Jack felt his throat tighten. "Beautiful," he said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "You're doing great, Mia." She smiled, her eyes shining. "We're like a family now, aren't we?" she asked, and her words hit him like a hammer hitting a nail. Jack didn't answer. He just patted her head and handed her the drawing back. "Go show your mom," he said, and Mia ran off, humming something about horseshoes. But her words stayed with him like a splinter. Family. The word was too big, too heavy for a man who had lost everything he had. By evening, Jack's mood had grown worse. He sat in his room, staring at the old pack of cigarettes he hadn't thrown out. The whiskey was gone, he hadn't bought it in a month, but the craving remained, like an old scar that aches in bad weather. He thought about Linda, the way she had looked that night in the motel, her tears, the words he hadn't let her finish. He thought about Roy, his smile, the way his fist had connected with his jaw, and the boxes, the ones he had moved without asking questions. He didn't know what was in them, but he knew it was wrong. The knowledge weighed on him like a stone around his neck. Claire found him in the backyard, standing by his van, staring at the rusty roof as if it might provide answers. "Jack," she called softly, her voice soft but firm. "What's wrong with you? You've been a shadow all day." He didn't turn around. "Nothing," he said, but his voice was hoarse, as if the words were stuck in his throat. "Don't lie," she replied, coming closer. "I can tell when you're lying. You're here, but it's like you're not there. What's keeping you here?" Jack clenched his fists, feeling the anger rise inside him. Not at Claire, not at Mia, at himself, at his past, at everything he couldn't let go of. "You wouldn't understand," he said, finally turning to face her. His eyes were dark, filled with a pain he couldn't express. "I had a life, Claire. A wife, a home, a job. I lost it all. And now I'm here, pretending everything is okay, but it's not." Claire didn't look away. "You're not pretending, Jack. You built this place with us. You helped me and Mia. You're not who you were, but that doesn't mean you're nobody." Her words were like a blow, not an angry one, but a wake-up call. Jack wanted to argue, wanted to say that she was wrong, that he didn't deserve this, not the motel, not her trust, not Mia's smiles. But instead he remained silent, feeling his anger give way to something else, weariness mixed with something that felt like hope. "I've done things I can't talk about," he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. "Things that won't let me go. I don't know how to go on, Claire. I don't know if I deserve this." She stepped closer, her hand on his shoulder, warm and firm. "No one knows if they deserve to be happy, Jack. But you're here. You chose to stay with us. That means something." He looked at her, and there was so much sincerity in her eyes that he felt vulnerable, like someone had stripped away his armor. He wanted to leave, to get in the van and drive away, like he always did when life got too hard. But he looked at the motel, at the lights in the windows, at Mia drawing on the pavement with chalk, and he knew he couldn't. Not now. "Give me time," he said, his voice hoarse but determined. "I'm trying." Claire nodded, her hand squeezing his shoulder. "We have time," she said. "But don't hide, Jack. Mia and I believe in you." She walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Jack stood by the van, looking up at the stars, which were brighter than they had been that night he'd been drinking whiskey at the gas station. He knew that the past would not go away, that the ghosts of Linda, Roy, those boxes would come back. But he also knew that he had a choice, for the first time in a long time. He could retreat into himself, as he had before, or he could try to move on, with Claire, with Mia, with this motel that had become their business. He went back to his room, took out a pack of cigarettes, and threw them in the trash. It was a small step, almost imperceptible, but it was a start. Jack lay down on his bed, closed his eyes, and for the first time in months, slept without whiskey, without nightmares, with the thought that maybe he could still find a way forward. A warm evening breeze blew dust across the Silver Horseshoe Motel parking lot, and the soft glow of the neon sign reflected in the puddles left by the morning rain. Jack Miller stood at the front desk, leaning against the wall, watching Mia draw intricate patterns on the asphalt with chalk, like stars and horseshoes. Her laughter, bright and carefree, mingled with the distant rumble of trucks on the highway, a familiar sound that was almost comforting. The motel was thriving. Rooms were full most nights, truckers were leaving tips, and Claire had begun to talk about expanding, maybe adding a few more rooms, or opening a small diner. Jack listened to her plans, nodded, occasionally chimed in, but inside he was still struggling with the shadow of the past, which seemed to recede but never quite disappear. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the aches in his muscles from a day spent fixing the air conditioner in one of the rooms. Work was his salvation. It kept his hands busy and his mind in check. Claire and Mia were his anchors, their presence filling the emptiness he'd carried inside him since losing everything. But sometimes, on nights like this, he found himself staring at the road, waiting for something or someone. He couldn't explain the feeling, but it was like a little itch under his skin that wouldn't go away. The sound of an engine interrupted his thoughts. A silver Hyundai Santa Fe pulled slowly into the parking lot, its headlights illuminating the flower beds that Claire and Mia had so carefully watered. Jack froze, his heart clenching as if someone had squeezed it with a fist. He knew that car. Even in the twilight, he would have recognized it anywhere. The scuff marks on the bumper, the flower sticker on the rear window. It was Linda's car. The car door opened, and she stepped out, still Linda, but somehow different. Her hair, once long and loose, was now pulled back into a neat ponytail, and her denim jacket had been replaced by a dark coat that looked too smart for this place. She paused when she spotted Jack, and her eyes, the ones he knew better than his own, met his. There was a mixture of uncertainty and something else in them, guilt, maybe, or hope. "Jack," she said, her voice soft but shaky, as if she'd rehearsed the words 1,000 times. I didn't know you were here. I was just passing through." Jack didn't answer right away. He looked at her, feeling old wounds he'd thought had begun to heal open up again. Passing by, in Kansas, hundreds of miles from their old home. It was no accident, and they both knew it. "What are you doing here, Linda?" he asked finally, his voice low, almost menacing. She took a step closer, her hands fiddling nervously with the strap of her bag. "I wanted to see you," she said. I need to talk. Please." Before Jack could respond, the reception door slammed and Claire stepped out onto the porch. Her gaze darted from Jack to Linda, and her face, usually open and warm, became tense. "Jack," she called, her tone cautious but wary. "Everything okay?" Linda looked at Claire, her eyes narrowing as if she were trying to figure out who this woman was and where she fit into Jack's life. "I'm Linda," she said, her voice a little firmer. "Jack's ex-wife." Claire froze, her lips pressed into a thin line. She nodded, but there was something sharp in her eyes, not anger, but something like pain. "I see," she said, crossing her arms. "And what brings you to our motel?" Linda opened her mouth to reply, but Jack interrupted. "Claire, give us a minute," he said, his voice firm, but inside he felt everything crumbling. Claire looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something he couldn't give, then nodded and walked back to the reception area, slamming the door a little too hard. Jack turned to Linda, his fists clenched. "Speak," he said. "What do you want?" She sighed, her shoulders slumping as if she were carrying a heavy load. "Jack, I made a mistake. That night, at the motel, it wasn't what you thought. Roy, he was just an acquaintance who promised to help with money. I was desperate, Jack. You know how hard it was for us. I didn't want to tell you because I knew you'd be mad." "And that's why you lied?" His voice was cold, but inside he felt a heat, like the old anger he'd buried was flaring up again. "You were there, Linda, in the middle of the night, with him, and you expect me to believe it was just about money." "It's true," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "I never cheated on you, Jack. I would never do that. I loved you. I love you." She took a step closer, her hand reaching out to him, but he stepped back. "I came to say that I'm sorry. I want to make things right." Jack looked at her, and his mind was a storm. He wanted to believe her, wanted to remember Linda, who had laughed at their wedding, who had made him sandwiches before flights, who had been his home. But he also remembered that night, her trembling voice, Roy, the blood on his fist. And he remembered Claire, her warm hand on his shoulder, her faith in him, her laughter as Mia drew them all together. Linda was his past, but Claire and Mia were his present, and he didn't know how to reconcile the two worlds. "You left, Linda," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "You filed for divorce. You made your choice." "I was angry," she said, her voice breaking. "You left, Jack. You didn't give me a chance to explain. I thought you didn't want to see me, but I can't live without you." She paused, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Give me a chance, please." Jack turned away, looking out at the parking lot at Mia, who was now sitting on the steps, hugging her knees. He felt torn in half. Part of him wanted to scream at Linda, to spill all the pain he carried inside, to blame her for everything that had gone wrong. Another part wanted to hug her, to forgive her, to go back to the way things had been. But there was a third part, the part that was thinking about Claire and Mia, about the motel, about the life he had begun to build. And that part was the loudest. Claire walked out of the reception area again, her steps quick, almost angry. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes darting between Jack and Linda. "Jack, I need you to check the wiring in room 5, she said, her voice tight as a string. "A guest is complaining." "Right now," Jack said, but he didn't move. He saw the way Claire looked at Linda, the way her hands clenched, and he knew she was jealous. Not because she was in love with him, or maybe she was, but because Linda was threatening everything they had built. Claire was part of the Silver Horseshoe, part of his new life, and Linda's arrival was like a crack in the foundation. "I don't mean to interrupt," Linda said, her voice quieter but bitter. I thought we could talk, but it seems you already have a new life." "It's not that simple," Jack said, his voice hoarse and tired. "You can't just show up and expect everything to go back to normal." "I know," she replied, wiping away her tears. "But I won't give up, Jack. I'll wait if I have to." She turned and walked toward her car, her steps slow, as if she hoped he would stop her. But Jack didn't move. He watched her climb into the Hyundai, the headlights flashing, the car disappearing into the darkness. And yet he sensed that she wasn't gone entirely, her presence lingered, like a shadow that would follow him. Claire stepped closer, her face unreadable. "Who is she to you now, Jack?" she asked, her voice quiet but steely. "Do you still love her?" Jack looked at her, and in her eyes he saw not only jealousy, but fear of losing what they had built, fear that he would retreat into himself again. He wanted to tell her that he didn't know, that his heart was a battlefield where the past and the present fought without a winner. But instead he said, "She's my past. You and Mia are my present." Claire nodded, but her eyes were still wary. "Then decide, Jack," she said, "because I don't want to be a second choice, and neither does Mia." She walked away, leaving him alone in the parking lot. Jack stood there, looking up at the stars, feeling the dilemma tearing at him. Should he take revenge on Linda? Should he make her feel the pain he felt? Should he forgive her, give her a chance, try to get back to what was? Or should he forget, let her go, let go of the past, and move on with Claire and Mia, with the motel, with this new, fragile life? He didn't know the answer, but he knew that this choice would determine who he would become: the man who kept running, or the man who finally stopped and started living. The warmth of the morning sun poured into the parking lot of the Silver Horseshoe Motel, reflecting off the freshly patched asphalt and illuminating the beds of daisies that Mia painstakingly watered each evening. Jack Miller stood at the front desk, holding a mug of coffee that had grown cold. His gaze slid over the familiar landscape, the sign blinking soft neon, the trucks parked at the far end, and Mia drawing on the sidewalk with chalk and humming something unintelligible. The motel had become his home, a place where he and Claire and Mia had built something real, something tangible. But the shadow of Linda from the night before still hung over him like a storm cloud ready to rain. Her words, her tears, her promises to make it all right, they had opened up old wounds that he had thought were healing. Jack knew he couldn't leave this hanging. Linda had said she'd wait, but he couldn't let her stay in his life, even as a ghost. He had to make a choice not just between her and Claire, but between the past that was holding him back and the present that was giving him a chance to start over. He finished his coffee, set the mug on the railing, and walked to the reception area, where Claire was sorting through the electric bills. Her movements were precise, but there was a tension in them, as if she were still reliving the night before. "Claire," Jack called, his voice quiet but firm. She looked up, a mixture of wariness and anticipation in her gaze. "I need to go away for a couple of hours. Something to do." Claire pressed her lips together but nodded. "Is it about her?" she asked, without mentioning Linda's name. Jack didn't lie. "Yes, I need to finish this, once and for all." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for the truth. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" she asked, her voice soft but with steel in it. "Because I don't want you to come back and say you've changed your mind." "I know," he said, feeling her words cut him, not from anger, but from honesty. "I'll be back, Claire. I promise." She nodded, but her gaze was still wary. "Okay, Mia and I will be here." Jack got out, climbed into his old van, and started the engine. He knew where to find Linda. She'd mentioned that she was staying at a hotel in a nearby town, 20 miles away. The road there was familiar; he'd driven it hundreds of times when he'd been a trucker. But today it felt different, as if each turn was part of a journey to something more than just conversation. He found her at the Sunset Road Motel, a cheap place with peeling paint and a parking lot littered with trash. Her Hyundai was parked outside the third room, and Jack felt his heart clench when he saw the familiar sticker on the rear window. He knocked on the door, and a few seconds later Linda opened it. She was wearing the same denim jacket she'd worn at their first wedding, but her face was paler than it had been the day before, and her eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Jack," she said, her voice shaking, "you're here." "We need to talk," he said, entering the room without waiting to be invited. The room was cramped, with a sagging mattress and the smell of old carpet. Jack remained standing, unwilling to sit down, unwilling to feel at home here. Linda closed the door, her hands shaking. "I knew you'd come," she said, trying to smile, but it came out weak, like a shadow. "I'm so glad, Jack. I couldn't sleep, thinking about what I said last night. I want to make it right. I know we can." Jack raised his hand, stopping her. "Linda, wait. Let me speak." He took a deep breath, feeling the words he'd been rehearsing the entire drive get stuck in his throat. "I didn't come here to fix this. I came here to finish." Her face changed, as if someone had turned off the light in her eyes. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice quieter, almost a whisper. "Jack, I told you I'm sorry. I know I made a mistake. But we can start over. We were happy, remember?" "I remember," he said, and his voice was heavy, as if each word weighed a ton. "I remember us laughing, planning for the future, you making me sandwiches before flights. I remember everything, Linda, but I also remember that night in the motel. Your words, your tears, Roja. And I remember you filing for divorce without giving me a chance to understand what was going on. I was desperate, she interrupted, her voice breaking. You left, Jack. You just left without saying a word. I thought you hated me. I thought you'd never come back. I may have left, he said, his eyes meeting hers. But you made a choice, Linda. You chose not to talk to me, not to explain. You chose Roy, the money, anything but me. And I lived with that all this time, thinking I was the one who ruined it. But the truth is, we both did. She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. I didn't want to lose you, Jack. I loved you. I love you. I came here to tell you that. I'd do anything to get you back. Jack felt his heart tighten, not with pain, but with clarity. He saw her, the woman he had once loved more than anything in the world, the woman who had been his home. But he also saw Claire, her warm smile, her faith in him, Mia, her drawings, her laughter. And he knew that Linda was the past, and Claire and Mia were his chance at a future. Linda, he said, his voice softer but determined. I don't hate you. I don't want to hurt you. But I can't go back. What we had is over. And I don't want to spend the rest of my life looking back, trying to fix what's already broken. She looked at him, her face wet with tears. What about love? She asked, her voice shaking. Can you really just forget everything we had? I won't forget, he said. I'll always remember you. But love, it doesn't keep us in the past. It gives us a chance to move forward. And I choose to move forward, Linda, with Claire, with Mia, with the motel. This is my life now. Linda hung her head, her shoulders shaking. Do you love her? She asked, without looking up. Jack paused, considering her question. He hadn't said it out loud, not even to himself, but the truth was clear as day. Yes, he said finally, I love her. And Mia, they gave me something I hadn't had in a long time, a home. Linda nodded, her hands tightening on the strap of her bag. I understand, she said, her voice barely audible. I was hoping, but I understand. She looked up, and there was pain in her eyes, but also something like relief. I wish you happiness, Jack. I really do. He nodded, feeling the weight he'd been carrying for months begin to dissolve. And I to you, Linda. Goodbye. He turned and walked out without looking back. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and he inhaled the cool air as if he could breathe deeply for the first time in a long time. He got into the van, started the engine, and drove back to the Silver Horseshoe, feeling every mile separate him from the past. When he returned, Claire was at the front desk, sorting through papers, but her movements were nervous, as if she were waiting for something. She looked up as he entered, and her face was tense, but there was hope in it. Well, she asked, her voice cautious. Jack walked up to her, stopping a step away. I'm done, he said. With Linda, with the past. I'm here, Claire, with you and Mia. Her eyes widened and she smiled, but there was uncertainty in her smile. Are you sure? She asked. Because I don't want to be just a replacement, Jack. I want to be your choice. He stepped closer, his hand touching her shoulder, warm and real. You're not a replacement, he said, his voice firm but gentle. You're the reason I want to go on living. You and Mia, I love you. Claire looked at him, her eyes shining with tears, but they weren't tears of pain. She nodded, her hand covering his. I love you too, Jack, she said, her voice full of warmth. We'll get through this, together. Mia ran into the reception area, her hair disheveled and her hands covered in chalk. Jack, she screamed, I drew a picture of us all. Do you want to see it? Jack smiled, feeling the last chains of the past fall from his shoulders. Sure, he said, taking her hand. Come on, show me. They walked out into the parking lot, where Mia pointed to her drawing of 3 figures holding hands under a brightly colored horseshoe. Jack looked at Claire, at Mia, at the motel, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was home. The past was behind him, and a new life lay before him, not perfect, but real, and he was ready to live it. It was a cool fall evening in Kansas, with the faint scent of fallen leaves and the distant hum of trucks speeding down the highway. The Silver Horseshoe Motel glowed in the twilight, its neon sign casting a soft silver glow over the parking lot where 3 trucks and a couple of cars were parked. The windows of the rooms glowed a warm yellow, and from the reception area came the soft strains of an old country song that Claire liked to play in the evenings. Jack Miller stood on the porch, a mug of hot coffee in his hands, looking out at the scene, feeling something inside him finally settle. The motel was more than just a building. It was a home that he, Claire, and Mia had built together, brick by brick, day by day. A year had passed since Linda had appeared in the parking lot, trying to take him back to the past. A year in which Jack had changed not suddenly, but slowly, like a tree putting down roots in new soil. He was no longer the man who drank whiskey alone, roaming the roads in a rusty van. Nor was he the trucker who lived by a schedule, but carried an emptiness inside him. He was Jack now, a man who found meaning in his work, in the people, in the life he had chosen. The motel was thriving. Claire was a genius at management. She kept records, negotiated with suppliers, smiled at guests in a way that kept them coming back again and again. Her ideas, adding a small diner with homemade pies and decorating the yard with lanterns, made the Silver Horseshoe a place that truckers from Iowa to Oklahoma were talking about. Jack did all the repairs and maintenance, fixing faucets, painting walls, making wooden benches for the yard. His hands, calloused from work, were now creating, not destroying. Mia, now 9, was their light. She ran around the motel, helping Claire behind the counter, painting signs for the diner, and asking Jack a million questions about how the world worked. Tonight was a special night. Claire had thrown a small party for the guests, nothing grand, just a barbecue in the backyard, with hamburgers, grilled potatoes, and lemonade that Mia proudly called her secret recipe. The backyard was decorated with strings of lights that Jack had hung the previous week, and their soft glow created a cozy atmosphere, as if the motel were an island of warmth in the endless darkness of the prairie. A few truckers sat at a wooden table, laughing and sharing stories about the road. A couple of tourists passing through Kansas took pictures of the sign, admiring its vintage charm. Mia darted among the tables, handing out paper plates and bragging about how she'd learned to roast marshmallows without burning them. Jack watched from the sidelines, feeling his heart fill with something he hadn't felt in years. Not just happiness that was too fragile, too unreliable a word. It was a sense of belonging, like he'd finally found his place. He finished his coffee, set the mug on the railing, and walked over to the grill, where Claire was flipping burgers, her face aglow with the heat of the fire and her smile. "Well, boss," he said, coming closer, "hasn't everything burned yet?" Claire laughed, her eyes glittering in the light of the flashlights. "I'm holding up so far," she said, handing him the spatula. "Want to try it, or are you afraid of ruining my masterpiece?" "I'd rather be the backup," Jack said, smiling. He picked up the plate of rolls and began to arrange them on the table, feeling her presence calm him. Claire wasn't just his motel partner, she was his home, his anchor, his reason to get up in the morning. They didn't talk about love in big words, but it was in every look, every touch, every day they spent together. Mia ran up, her cheeks smeared with ketchup, holding a stick of toasted marshmallow. "Daddy, try this," she said, handing him the candy. "I made it perfect." Jack froze, his heart skipping a beat. She had called him Daddy. Not Jack, not Mr. Jack, but Daddy. The word was so simple, so ordinary, but to him it was like an electric shock, unexpected, enlivening, warm. He looked at Mia, at her shining eyes, and felt a lump in his throat, preventing him from speaking. "Perfect," he said finally, picking up a marshmallow and taking a bite. The sweetness melted on his tongue, and he smiled despite the tears that suddenly stung his eyes. "You're doing great, Mia." She beamed and ran off to join the other children playing in the yard, leaving Jack standing there, feeling the word, "Daddy," echo in his chest. Claire noticed his reaction and came closer, her hand gently touching his elbow. "She's wanted to name you that for a long time," Claire said quietly, her voice full of warmth. "I told her it had to be her decision. It looks like she has." Jack nodded, not trusting his voice. He looked at Mia, at her disheveled hair, at her laughter, and thought about how far he had come from the man he had been a year ago. He had been a shadow then, a man who drank to forget, who carried boxes without asking questions, who had lost everything he had. Now he was here, with Claire, with Mia, with the motel they had brought to life together. And that word, Dad, was like a key that opened the door to a new life. Claire, he said, turning to her, I never thought I'd have something like this. Mia, you saved me. Claire smiled, her eyes glittering in the light of the flashlights. We saved each other, Jack, she said, her voice soft but firm. You gave us a chance when we were on the sidelines. Now we're here, together. He took her hand, her fingers warm despite the chill of the evening. I want this to be forever, he said, his voice hoarse but sincere. You, Mia, are the motel. I want to be here, with you. Claire squeezed his hand, her smile widening. We're not going anywhere, she said. You're stuck with us, Miller. They laughed, and the laughter was like music, mixing with the country tunes playing from the reception area. Jack felt the last shadows of the past Linda, Roy, the boxes, the pain retreating, dissolving into this moment. They weren't gone, and perhaps they never would be, but they no longer had power over him. He had made a choice, and that choice had brought him here, to the light in the windows, to Mia's laughter, to Claire's warmth. The party continued. Truckers told stories, tourists praised Claire's pies, and Mia taught a boy how to properly roast marshmallows. Jack and Claire worked side by side, serving food, clearing plates, exchanging glances that spoke louder than words. When the evening ended and the last of the guests went to their rooms, Jack, Claire, and Mia remained in the courtyard, clearing tables. Daddy, Mia said, running up to him with another postcard, I drew us. Look, this is a motel, and this is us, and the stars, because they always shine above us. Jack picked up the drawing, his fingers sliding over the jagged lines. There were 3 figures on the paper, holding hands, beneath a bright horseshoe surrounded by stars. He looked at Mia, at Claire, and felt something inside him finally make sense. This is the best drawing I've ever seen, he said, his voice quiet but full of emotion. Thank you, Mia. She hugged him, her small arms wrapped around his waist, and Jack hugged her back, feeling the warmth of her embrace fill the last of the empty spaces in his heart. Claire came over, her hand on his shoulder, and they stood there, the 3 of them, under the stars that shone above the silver horseshoe. Later, after Mia had fallen asleep in her room and the other guests had left, Jack and Claire sat on the porch, looking up at the dark sky. The fairy lights were still on, and their light reflected in Claire's eyes, making them even brighter. You know, Jack said, his voice thoughtful but calm, I thought my life was over when I lost Linda. I thought I'd never find anything worthwhile again. But then I met you and Mia, and this motel, it became more than just a job. It became a home. Claire smiled, her hand finding his. You made this home, Jack, she said, not just for us, but for yourself. You're stronger than you know. He shook his head, but his smile was warm. Maybe so, but I know one thing. I don't want to be anywhere else, just here with you. They sat in silence, listening to the wind rustling the grass, the radio in the reception area playing an old Johnny Cash song. Jack looked at the motel, at the light in the windows, and knew that he had finally found his place. He wasn't the same person he'd been before, but he was better, stronger, wiser, more alive. And that light in the windows, that laugh of Mia's, that hand of Claire's in his, that was all he needed. Hi friends, write in the comments what city you are from. Perhaps you also had similar stories. It is very interesting to know what happened in your corner of the world. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like it, share your thoughts or stories in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. There are more exciting and unexpected stories ahead. All characters and events described in this story are fictitious. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. Do not judge strictly. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.